true test is yet to come.
Come what may, we will never cease to believe. Upon the souls of they who have sacrificed themselves to pave the way for peace, we will never abandon our cause.
1,000-year war cannot be ended in a day. It may take generations. What thou dost begin, thy children must continue. Entrust unto them thy hopes and dreams, that peace may reign again, and forevermore.
Midgardsormr, or Jormungandr. Both names my mouth does not enjoy pronouncing at all. I only have a few Old Norse friends and they are all called Thor, and I'm probably mispronouncing that as well. I would go for the proper pronunciations for every single name in this video, but I'm gonna butcher the ones I do try already, so let's not piss off my Icelandic friends more than I already am. The name you've probably heard most is Jormungandr, but both these names describe the same world-enveloping serpent. Midgardsormr is what he's called in Final Fantasy XIV, so that's what I'm going to be calling him from here on out. It's also slightly easier to pronounce, I think. In Final Fantasy he's mostly a dragon, but he looks very worm-like in 14, so it still fits. Today I'm going to talk to you about the mythology involving all of these dragons, but because I like to complicate things for myself, I will also talk about Midgardsormr in Final Fantasy and eventually his brood. So be warned, there are going to be spoilers up to and including Heaven's Ward of Final Fantasy XIV. And it's going to be a little bit of a loose theory grabbing kind as well, but it makes for a nice red line, I guess, I hope. Enjoy!
Midgardsormr, the world's serpent, which is actually the literal translation of his name as far as I'm aware. I'm sure most people have heard of this creature at some point in their lives, as he's used often enough whenever anything vaguely Norse is called upon. Most recently, God of War. In mythology, Midgardsormr was the middle child to the giantess Angerboda and Loki. Yes, that Loki. I don't need to tell you that Loki wasn't well loved in most accounts among the gods of Asgard, and not just because he slept with a horse. But in particular, his children were a problem because it was foretold that Loki's children would be the downfall of the Aesir. So, to remedy that situation, Odin thought it might be helpful to render each child incapable of doing any sort of world-destroying damage at all. In Midgardsormr's case, Odin threw the serpent into the sea. I guess Odin just forgot that sea snakes were a thing because Midgardsormr kept growing and growing until he was so large he encircled the entire world, biting his own tail to form a lovely sea serpent-sized world hug. So far, you're probably familiar with the tale, the serpent biting its own tail. This actually makes Midgardsormr an Uroboros. That's not strictly an Old Norse concept, though. This particular type of symbolism was first seen in ancient Egypt, and didn't find its way to the rest of the world until the Greek society adopted it in its magical traditions. Particularly, it was heavily linked to alchemy, but it was given a whole host of different meanings, one of the most known ones being the circle of life, death and rebirth. Not strange, given that the Egyptian source for Uroboros was the enigmatic Book of the Netherworld, where two of the creatures were seen encircling, presumably the newly born Ra Osiris. The Uroboros in question were manifestations of the snake god Mehen, who aided Ra throughout his journey in the underworld. The image altogether represents the beginning and the end of time.
Let's rewind to Final Fantasy for a minute, because otherwise I can't turn this into a strange theory video. When you meet Midgardsormr in most Final Fantasies, he's either an enemy or a temporary reluctant ally. In Final Fantasy XIV, he's kind of both. When we meet him for the first time, we're actually meeting his corpse in Mordona. In case you're wondering why Midgardsormr is for all intents and purposes dead, it's because he fought the Imperial Dreadnought Agrius at some point, and him and the entire Dreadnought crashed into Silvertear Lake, where they basically killed each other, so to speak.
The Observatorium's astrologians have sounded the alarm. Last night, the Dragon Star burned with an intensity not seen in 15 summers. Not since the Dravanians engaged the Empire in the Battle of Silvertear Skies.
The northern sky doth burn full bright upon the Wormlord's call. The red behemoth beckoneth, and flame consumeth all.
The old Curthan rhyme, aye. The brightening of the dragon star is said to accompany the roar of a great worm. The astrologians believe that it was Midgardsormr himself who cried out on this occasion.
The Ishgardians think Midgardsormr called to his brood, but they were mistaken. It was actually one of his children, Nidhogg. Yes, in Final Fantasy, Midgardsormr has no less than 7 children. Bahamut, Tiamat, Nidhogg, Reisvelgr, Ratatoskr, Azdaja and Vrtra. A lot of these dragons, or worms rather, show up in more than a single Final Fantasy, of course, but in this case, they're all related. More specifically, the 7 of them together are called the First Brood. Midgardsormr doesn't originally hail from Hydaelyn. Instead, he comes from a distant world known as the Dragon Star to us. Said home was eventually attacked by another nearby star, and even though Midgardsormr managed to defeat their strongest weapon momentarily, he was still forced to flee with 7 of his eggs on his back. Eventually, he landed on Hydaelyn and hatched said eggs. Once the resulting dragonlings were fully grown, they each set out to their own little part of the world. Bahamut and Tiamat left for Mericidia to start their very own brood together, spawning a large portion of the new dragonkin generations. Their fate was not a kind one, however, as the Allagan Empire, power-hungry as they were, attacked Mericidia during the Third Astral Era, eventually killing Bahamut. His sister, Tiamat, through her grief, was easily tricked by the Ascians, who managed to persuade her to try and revive Bahamut as a primal. At the same time, the Ascians taught the Allagan Emperor, Xandi, how to trap primals. And so, after poor Tiamat revived her brood brother, he was immediately trapped in a gigantic fake moon called Dalamud. Along with a good amount of their dragonkin, Tiamat herself was imprisoned all the same, and although she would otherwise be able to free herself, she did not, for she felt she deserved this punishment to pay for her folly. Fast forwarding a little, we find ourselves in the middle of the Battle of Carteneau, the culmination of a war with the Garlean Empire, who had destroyed the one mechanical contraption keeping Dalamud, and with it Bahamut, in the sky. Dalamud was now slowly but surely descending into Hydaelyn, and eventually breaking apart, releasing Bahamut. The real Bahamut had died long ago at this point, of course, and this newly summoned primal Bahamut, fueled by the rage and sorrow of Tiamat, was nothing like the old Bahamut. This one seemed to focus primarily on destruction, and while he was eventually defeated by a rather powerful lad named Louis Sois, it did literally end the first version of Final Fantasy XIV.
Later on, in the newly rebooted Final Fantasy XIV, we actually find out that Bahamut was more or less put into stasis, the primal Bahamut that is, and Louis Sois punched the guy so hard that he ceased to exist and turned into a phoenix primal instead. So during our questline at the time, we punch the dragon again, so he cuts that out.
Bahamut originates from Arabia, where he's actually responsible for keeping the planet in one piece, ironically. Although he's not technically a dragon, he's described as a giant sea serpent in some parts, which I suppose comes close enough, although others name him a giant whale, or a fish even. Even then, he's a pretty interesting looking whale if you ask me. According to the Arabic tales, Bahamut lies at the bottom of the rather bizarre structure that holds up the earth. On top of Bahamut stands a bull. On top of that bull sits a large slab of gemstone, and on that slab sits an angel who shoulders the earth.
I will now link this to Final Fantasy in the loosest way imaginable. To be allowed entry into the Bahamut raid, you have to do 3 trials first. Ifrit, with his bull aesthetic, Titan, a literal living piece of rock, and Garuda, who has a lot of angelic aesthetics going on. This works, there you go, irrefutable proof, totally based on the real mythology Bahamut.
So, what about his sister wife, Tiamat? She doesn't have quite as much lore in Final Fantasy XIV, yet at least. But I hope they'll eventually do something that includes her, given the rich story of her namesake. Tiamat hails from ancient Babylon and is the primordial goddess of the Salt Sea. And boy, at least they gave her that trait in the game. Hard to find one saltier about her mistakes than Tiamat. But that's not the only definitely very real mythological link here. Tiamat was known for having birthed the younger gods by mating with the freshwater god. But in another myth, she is instead known as the embodiment of chaos. And really, this aligns quite nicely with her birthing the next generation of dragons first, followed by the utter chaos she unleashed when she unwittingly summons the greatest and most destructive of all primals, her husband Bahamut, leading her to her now self-inflicted imprisonment at Azizla. When it comes down to it, most of Tiamat's myths revolve around her fury rather than her peaceful side. One of them includes her husband Apsu, who, after the two of them birthed a whole host of children, grew fearful that his children wanted to kill him and usurp his throne. He was right, but the war he started to fix it didn't really go his way, and so he died. Strangely, that made Tiamat angry too, and she continues his war while in the shape of a massive sea dragon, also summoning a whole host of monsters to fight alongside her, including the first dragons. She still dies, and apparently her body was so massive that her killer managed to form the heavens and the earth by cutting up her body.
In yet another story, it is said that Tiamat summoned 11 monsters to her side to do battle alongside her and to avenge Apsu. I won't try to butcher their names by saying it in the real language, but their translations are pretty cool all on their own. Venomous snake, great dragon, exalted serpent, furious snake, violent storms, mad lion, scorpion man, bull man, fish man, hairy one, and big weather beast. Okay, so some of them are not that cool, but most of them are pretty cool. One of them is a great dragon, that still counts.
Bahamut and Tiamat largely stand on their own in terms of both their lore and mythology. Bahamut is often called the Dragon King in various other Final Fantasy installments, so that's not strange, and his consort was derived from an actual goddess of creation to match him. The next three dragons, however, are far more closely entwined with their sire, Reisvelgr, Nidhogg, and Ratatoskr. They each have a very central role in the Heavensward expansion. Ratatoskr somewhat less so, her being dead and all, but she is still the catalyst of the story, and therefore quite important. As you might have guessed already, all three of their names come from the Old Norse tales. Specifically, they're talked about in the Poetic Edda. You might think you've not heard of the Poetic Edda before, but you have. It's where the majority of our knowledge from the Old Norse mythology comes from, and this includes Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. What you might not know is that the information on each of the well-known characters, such as Nidhogg, Ratatoskr, and even Jormungandr, is pretty limited. Everyone only really gets a short line here or there, and Reisvelgr, the poor sod, is the chief concern here. Practically nothing is said about the lad. He's mentioned once when, depending on the version, either Odin or Gylfi asks the question, "Whence comes the wind?" And the answer is, in prose, he is called Reisvelg, who sits at heaven's end, a giant in the shape of an eagle. From his wings, they say the wind comes over all people. And that is the extent of his mentions, although it might be good to know that his name apparently translates to corpse swallower in Old Norse. Make of that what you will.
Although, honestly, Ratatoskr doesn't really fare much better. Ratatoskr is the squirrel that runs up and down the world tree Yggdrasil and carries messages to Nidhogg and Reisvelgr. Yeah, if you're as ridiculous as me, you can probably already see where I'm going with this theory.
Nidhogg gets the most extensive mention of them all. He is the serpent who gnaws at the roots of the world tree, Yggdrasil. And here's a strange link to his brother in Final Fantasy, actually. While Reisvelgr's name might mean corpse swallower, Nidhogg literally does that. He chews on the corpses of the inhabitants of Nastrond, basically on the shores of Hell. His main course consists of murderers, adulterers, and oathbreakers. His lovely abode is described as such in the Edda. A hall I saw, far from the sun. On Nastrond it stands, and the doors face north. Venom drops through the smoke vent down, for around the walls do serpents wind. I there saw, wading through rivers wild, treacherous men and murderers too, and workers of ill with the wives of men. There Nidhogg sucked the blood of the slain, and the wolf tore men. Would you know yet more? These stories all seem only roughly related, perhaps, but let's have a look at Final Fantasy XIV and pick up where we left off. with Midgardsormr and the reason we went to meet him in the first place. A dragon had roared, the dragon star burned in the sky, and the Curthan rhyme mentioned, "The northern sky doth burn full bright upon the Worm Lord's coal." You're likely familiar with most of what Ragnarok entails, but I'm just going to take out my tinfoil hat here. One of the signs that Ragnarok has begun is unrest at sea. Jormungandr finally releases its tail from its mouth and finds its way onto dry land. At that moment, Fenrir will set ablaze one half of the world with fire, while Jormungandr fills the other half with poison. And so, Ragnarok begins. And while it isn't called the same thing in Final Fantasy XIV, that is basically what happens. The Dragon Song War finally comes to a head after 1,000 years, with Nidhogg flying out to attack Ishgard once again. But this time, after intervention from the Warrior of Light, among other people, Nidhogg is defeated once and for all. And although the war was brutal and bloody, as in Ragnarok, peace reigns again and the world is reborn anew. But how did we come to this exactly? Well, the three dragons, Reisvelgr, Nidhogg and Ratatoskr, lived together peacefully for a time, until the Elizin tribes that would eventually form Ishgard entered the Dravanian lands where the dragons roamed. The pre-Ishgardian tribes sought to claim the land for themselves, unsurprisingly, and although they didn't quite get along initially, peace was eventually achieved through the union of a dragon and an Elizin, Reisvelgr and Saint Shiva. That peace was short-lived, unfortunately, when the Ishgardians betrayed the dragons by murdering Ratatoskr and eating her eyes so they might absorb their draconic strength. As you do, Nidhogg, not a fan of this event, attacked the now wildly more powerful 12 knights responsible, killing their king and 4 other knights before Nidhogg too had his eyes gouged out. Nidhogg, not willing to die just yet, next went to visit Reisvelgr, demanding one of his brother's eyes so he might continue his war against Ishgard as vengeance for his fallen sister. Reisvelgr agreed, and from that point on, Nidhogg would attack Ishgard every so often before going back to sleep for a while again. While Nidhogg and his brood could have easily destroyed Ishgard and its denizens completely, they never did, because Nidhogg wanted the offspring of the 12 knights to simply suffer for eternity instead of being put out of their misery.
Mind you, Midgardsormr was around for all of this. Why he didn't lift a finger to try and help his children, no one knows. That's a dragon thing, I suppose. But somewhere in the middle of it, he actually took over the brood of Nidhogg and everyone else as well to aid him in the battle that would at the time be his last over Silvertear Lake. And the moment he woke up, he didn't go to check on his brood, although he did wake up because of Nidhogg. No, he travels with the Warrior of Light. Every so often, he'll pop up in a tiny dragon whelpling form, no matter how inconvenient the time is, to tell you the tale of his people.
Warrior of Light,
Really?
I must regale thee with a tale of mine youth.
Now is really not the time.
I was but freshly hatched one summer morn. Thou cannot imagine the rumbly in my tumbly.
Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, how are you going to link any of that to mythology? Well, you might call me Elastigirl when it comes to theories, because I can stretch endlessly. Although, before jumping into this, there is one pretty obvious parallel, I suppose. The eyes. The eyes have power. You probably already know this, but in mythology, Odin gave up one of his eyes to drink from the Well of Urd, which would give him far more wisdom than he already possessed. And in Final Fantasy XIV, the eyes also represent the strength of the dragons. Reisvelgr actually gives up his eye twice, once to save his brother's life, and another time to give to the Warrior of Light to defeat that same brother.
While Reisvelgr might not have much to go on regarding his own mythology, I think the actual eagle giant was only half of his inspiration here. The other was still another eagle. Who knows? Maybe the Poetic Edda meant the same eagle anyway. I'm talking about the eagle at the top of Yggdrasil, of course. At the top of Yggdrasil lives an eagle. A hawk sits between the eyes of this unnamed eagle, and this hawk is called Verfolnir. Indeed, Verfolnir. We've seen that name before in Final Fantasy XIV as well, where he's introduced as a child of Reisvelgr. He also serves as one of the dragons that tests our champion's combat capabilities on behalf of Reisvelgr. But another dragon is present for those same tests, Vidofnir. In mythology, Vidofnir is said to be a rooster that sits atop the Mimamæðr, which, in a great many accounts, is thought to simply be another name for the world tree Yggdrasil. Next, we have Nidhogg, who is said to have a rivalry with the eagle that lives at the top of the world tree, which, in our comparison, would be Reisvelgr. And we definitely see that one come back in Final Fantasy. Finally, we have Ratatoskr. What does a squirrel have to do with anything, you might ask? Well, Ratatoskr carries messages from Nidhogg to Reisvelgr, of course, but it's said that the squirrel is a rather mischievous creature. Some have theorized that Ratatoskr intentionally twisted the messages somewhat to make them even worse.
What? Tell him his breath stinks.
Hey, Nidhogg says your swamp odor emanating from your mouth smells so bad that the dead are dying all over again down there.
What? Tell him he's an unwashed swine himself.
Hey, Reisvelgr says the stink from your corporeal shell is so bad he can smell it all the way up there and it's killing the foliage and his appetite.
What? Tell him!
The point is that Ratatoskr was the catalyst for the Dragon Song War. Having been killed, Nidhogg wanted to kill everyone else, and Reisvelgr, who still loved Shiva, didn't want to join in the Dragon Song War. She actually doubles in her messenger role because she was killed while she was a messenger for the dragons, invited to the Ishgardian table to talk about further peace. So I guess you could say that they shot the messenger.
So, that's Final Fantasy XIV's own little Ragnarok. Although the world doesn't technically end, we do kill a god. Another one of the first brood of Midgardsormr. Now 3 have fallen, and only 4 are left. One of which is imprisoned by her own choice, but 2 of them we've not even met. Azdaja and Vrtra. I wonder if we'll ever see them in Final Fantasy XIV, and if so, in what form? Azdaja appears in more than one story. One is a Slavic dragon, specifically Bosnia. Azdaja was a gigantic serpent who was awoken by a loud party. When he slithered out of the canyon he was hidden in to put a stop to the ruckus, the partygoers quickly responded by chanting a prayer which petrified Azdaja forever. But there are also stories of Azdaja to be found in Persia, each insisting on their serpent-like appearance, only growing to have wings once they were thrown into the sea by the gods, because Azdaja terrorized the people on land too much. Vrtra, on the other hand, is found in Hinduism and often represented drought. Vrtra kept the waters of the world captive until he was finally killed by the god Indra. A short story, I suppose, but most of his legend, unfortunately, just deals with how Indra killed him and all that. And there are other stories involving Vrtra, but they largely end the same. It's just that he's killed for a slightly different reason.
And with that, we are at the end of Midgardsormr's brood. I find mythology fascinating, which means that in Final Fantasy I have a lot to read up about, because they do love taking names from mythology. And this is really not the only one.
I do want to leave you with a question, though. In the original Final Fantasy XI game, a different MMO, and yes, one that's still running to this day, Midgardsormr's brood also makes an appearance. Or rather, it's Worm King Bahamut's brood in this one. Every dragon from the first brood in 14 is present, but there are several other names to be found too. Some of them can actually be found in Fates, dungeons, or even Eureka, like Quelebra or Fafnir, and yes, even Jormungand apparently, so they're accounted for. However, Cynoprosopi, Dragua, Uryu, and Smok aren't mentioned anywhere in the game. Of these 4, Uryu seems the most likely candidate to have anything interesting happen at all, given that he was involved in some of the harder questlines and even had his own little raid. Personally, I'd like to see more dragon questlines in Final Fantasy XIV, but what do you think? Will we see them again? Or is the dragon chapter closed after the Dragon Song War? I hope you enjoyed my little tinfoil hat Final Fantasy XIV mythology run, and until next time, Vafe.
Hi, yeah, no, it's Jinzy. I'm just calling for some of the lost and founds. Since we lost a few dragons in our part, yeah, I kind of need your help identifying here. So from the top, Wall Guy. Yeah, has that rung any bells there? Mm-hmm. 8-7 whole, or 8 parts of 7, or I mean, are they all dead? Yes, already digested. Okay, well. So what you're saying is bird feathers? Interesting look. Okay. Bird feathers. 8, 7 whole goats. People. 8, 7 whole people. And flew off laughing. Okay, yes. Right, so, Robertson S.O. Yes, this one has some credentials apparently. Already did attack a town. I did mean to call about that sooner. Listen, Michael, I need to find this Robertson S.O. Rather quickly. Not gonna lie, we can't really lose another village. Okay, yes. Faster than light. Okay, yeah, that might be a problem. I will look into that, of course. Yes, thank you, Michael. All right, okay, so Lochmuin then. Known. Oh, okay. Diamond Dragon. Ah, so you've heard of this one. Well, what is he doing in the middle of the earth? Well, he's not supposed to be in the middle of the earth, is he, Michael? Michael, what is he doing in the middle of the earth? Having a nap. Okay. Well, get him out of there, because I don't believe he has the passports to reside in the middle of the earth. Okay, MJS Coolstaff. How about that one? We have anything on that one? She has how many heads? Michael, no, Michael, stop. Michael, how many heads have you cut off this particular dragon? 42. And at no point did you think that perhaps this was a Hydra class? Michael? Michael. No, you're gonna have to call Hercules again. This is not going on my paycheck, Michael, please. Alright, septic. A cat head. A singular cat head? A singular cat head. Okay. A singular cat head. With smoke attacks. Only smoke attacks? Well, no, it doesn't really sound very threatening. No, I can't. Okay. Suffocates entire cities within seconds. Okay, no, I got you. Alright. Mike Zveers. How about that one? Okay, so 3 tsunamis, 4 tornadoes, an earthquake. Is this a multi-elemental? Sounds like a multi-elemental to me. Alright, well, might get NASA involved, I suppose. Adrian Peckle. That should be our last one. Well, how could they have started a brood already? They've been gone for a week. 2 weeks, tops. They started a whole brood. With who? Oh, Lord almighty. Alright, well, Adrian Peckle and their brood of dragons. Alright, well, again, Michael, that is not coming out of my paycheck, and Hercules isn't going to deal with that either, so I suggest you pray to another god, perhaps one of the other Greek pantheons. Good luck with that. Thank you very much.